Imagine a nation of 7 million people. Now, try to picture a British diplomatic report, this is from the late 70s, stating starkly that, quote, a nation of 7,000 people has been transformed into a nation of 7 million slaves. The unburied dead cry for vengeance, and the living dead for pity, and cry both in vain.
That quote, it just hits you, doesn't it? The sheer chilling brevity of it. It really gets to the profound horror. We're talking roughly 1.7 million lives lost in just a handful of years.
1.7
It's
million.
a staggering number, a quarter of Cambodia's entire population at the time. I mean, it's a scale of suffering that's almost, it's hard to wrap your head around.
Truly, the numbers themselves are just devastating, but they really only hint at these deep, lingering questions, don't they? Questions that still haunt us about this period. How could something like this immense tragedy unfold so quickly, so brutally?
Exactly. And beyond just the terror itself, what does it actually mean for a society? How do you even begin to rebuild when your very foundations have been, well, just so savagely ripped apart?
It leads into what we're exploring in this deep dive. It's not just about recounting the facts, because sadly, what happened during the Cambodian genocide under the Khmer Rouge is tragically well documented in many ways.
Right. What remains, I think, truly unsolved for us, and this is the central mystery we really want to unpack, isn't so much who committed the crimes. The main perpetrators, they're largely known. It's more about the why.
Why did it happen?
Yes. Why did such unfathomable brutality take root and persist? How was it all orchestrated? And maybe most importantly, how does a society actually grapple with that kind of devastating aftermath? What does recovery even look like?
And there's another layer too, isn't there? How did this regime responsible for such terror manage to get into power in the first place? How did they implement these incredibly extreme policies? And maybe the most disturbing part for many, how did they command international recognition, even when the world knew, or at least had reports about the horrors?
It's deeply unsettling.
It really raises that question. What are the enduring echoes, the ripples of this terror for the survivors, obviously, but also for the nation as a whole and for the very concept of justice itself?
Indeed. So we're going to try and peel back the layers of this incredibly complex and deeply disturbing history. We'll look at everything from the, well, surprising origins of the regime's leader, Pol Pot,
Who we'll get into shortly.
to the delicate and, let's be honest, often morally compromised dance of global diplomacy that went on around it. And of course, the profound ongoing struggle for healing, for accountability, that continues right up to this day in Cambodia. It's a story that just, it demands our attention still.
Okay, so let's start right at the beginning then. With the man who would become the architect of this nightmare, Salah Tsar, better known, of course, as Pol Pot. And what's really fascinating, as you hinted, is that his early life, it wasn't what you might typically picture for someone who becomes a genocidal dictator.
Not at all.
His childhood, from many accounts, was actually quite unusual, marked by, surprisingly, a degree of privilege. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, it's really important context, I think, because it challenges a lot of assumptions. Saul Tsar's family actually had connections to Cambodian royalty. His cousin, a woman named Meek, she was a consort of King Sisaweth Manavong. Later, she even served as a ballet teacher at the royal court.
Wow, okay.
So when Saul Tsar was about 6, he and an older brother were sent to live with Meek in Phnom Penh. This wasn't uncommon. Actually, wealthier relatives, often sort of informally adopted children, gave them better opportunities. And he even spent about 18 months as a novice monk.
A monk?
Yes, which exposed him to Buddhist teachings, traditional Khmer literacy. So this early life, paints a picture steeped in traditional Cambodian society, royal connections, religious life, albeit from a relatively privileged position.
So you've got this grounding in tradition, royalty, religion, but then his education takes a very different turn, doesn't it? What about his time at the Roman Catholic primary school, the École Miche? How did that experience, or maybe other less conventional things in his youth, start shaping his worldview?
Right, the École Miche is quite telling. Most of his classmates there were children of French colonial bureaucrats or Catholic Vietnamese. So suddenly he's in a very different cultural, different social environment compared to his earlier life.
A real shift.
A huge shift. He learned French, became familiar with Christianity, but he wasn't a standout student, not academically distinguished at all. In fact, he was held back 2 years. He only got his primary certificate when he was 18, which was unusually late.
Mhm.
And this mix,
Yeah.
privilege on one hand, but then academic struggle, repeated failures in this European-style school system.
Mm.
Some sources see that as a pretty strong indicator for deviant behavior later on.
Yeah.
There's speculation that this might have shaped a growing sense of resentment, maybe against established systems. Or perhaps it fueled a desire for something completely different, a radical new order. And there's another layer, too, apparently. While visiting his cousin at the palace, he reportedly had some of his first sexual experiences with the king's concubines. Another unconventional, possibly formative experience in his youth.
That's quite a detail,
Yeah.
especially thinking about his later life. So he fails exams for the upper classes at the Lycée Sisowath, a more elite school, and then ends up enrolling in a carpentry technical school in 1948. That must have felt like a huge step down.
Oh, absolutely. A very abrupt shift.
Yeah.
Potentially quite humiliating, you can imagine. Going from this sort of elite academic path, suddenly he's in a vocational school. His peers are generally from a lower social class. It could certainly have intensified any existing feelings of, resentment or maybe disillusionment.
But something important happened there too, right?
Yes. Crucially, it was during this period he met Ing Sari, who would become an incredibly close friend and later a really key figure in his Khmer Rouge government. That connection turned out to be far more significant than, any carpentry skills he picked up.
Okay, and then we arrive at what you called a negative turning point for him, those years in Paris. So 1949, he's 24. He gets one of only 5 scholarships to study engineering in France. I mean, that sounds like an amazing opportunity. What went wrong? Or perhaps what went differently than expected?
On the surface, yes, an incredible opportunity. It put him in this tiny elite group of Cambodians studying abroad. He went to study radio electronics, and initially he actually did okay, got good marks. But then he failed his first end-of-year exams. Passed the retake, but only just. And crucially, over the 3 years he was in Paris, he seems to have made very little real effort to kind of assimilate into French culture. Never got fully comfortable with the language, apparently, even though he was reading people like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, whose ideas, about the general will social contract, they can definitely be twisted in radical directions.
That's fascinating. You'd think Paris would broaden horizons, but it sounds like he almost retreated, resisted assimilation. He even volunteered in Yugoslavia at one point, building a motorway.
Yes, the Federal People's Republic of Yugoslavia back then. He spent a month there with a communal labor battalion. That experience itself might not have been the main thing, but it was part of his growing connection with other like-minded Cambodians. The real shift, the crucial influence, came through his friendships in Paris.
Right, the network.
Exactly. His most important relationships were with Ing Sari, who he knew from before, Kiernan Mum, and King Van Sack. It was Ing Sari and others who formed this clandestine group called the Circle Marxiste.
The Marxist Circle.
A secret study group arranged in hidden cells. They devoured Marxist texts, held these intense self-criticism sessions. Classic Communist Party stuff. Soth Sar joined one of these cells, helped print their little newspaper. This was his real doorway into that radical intellectual scene.
So that was the gateway, but what made him specifically so receptive? Given his background, the privilege, the academic indifference you mentioned?
It's a good question. His perhaps prior loneliness, maybe that feeling of not quite fitting in academically, it likely played a big role. He might have felt alienated, and this group offered a very strong sense of identity, of purpose. You have to remember the context. Post-war Paris.
Right.
Communism was seen by many intellectuals as the future. The Chinese Communist Party had just won their civil war in 1949. The French Communist Party was huge, pulling in a quarter of the vote. It was a powerful, intellectually vibrant environment for radical ideas.
So the timing and place were key.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
This period really seems to have transformed Salatzar's mindset. It became truly revolutionary, marked by what sources describe as a clear desire for power. And ironically, his lack of fancy diplomas, his academic struggles, that might have actually been an advantage within an increasingly anti-intellectual party that often saw formal education as, a corrupting influence of the old bourgeois order.
Okay, so he returns to Cambodia, steeped in these radical ideas, and then his personal life continues to intersect with politics, sometimes quite painfully, it seems. Tell us about the Sung Son Meili affair. You mentioned it created a dual setback.
Yeah, this is quite revealing. Back in Cambodia, Salatzar fell for Son Son Meili, who came from a wealthy family. But she ended things with him after his political party, the Democratic Party, lost the 1955 elections. She chose to date someone seen as more politically influential. Exactly. So it was this personal rejection combined with the political defeat. A friend and mentor figure, Ken Van Sack, later described it as this dual setback. And Van Sack believed it touched off a cycle of sexual and political frustration that would embitter Pol Pot for life.
That's a really powerful psychological insight, suggesting a deep personal bitterness feeding into his later ruthlessness.
It's certainly a compelling perspective. And then his marriage to Q Ponery, which apparently surprised people because she was older, higher social rank.
Right. What brought them together?
Well, despite the differences, they shared this profound common interest in utopian politics, a shared revolutionary mindset. And, there are criminological theories that suggest marrying a partner who's also deeply involved in radical or criminal activities can actually enhance your own engagement in those activities. It reinforces the worldview, doesn't deter it.
Creates an echo chamber, almost.
In a way, yes. And sadly, shortly after their marriage, Q Ponery was diagnosed with uterine cancer, which meant they couldn't have children. This period seems to have just solidified his path. He plunged deeper into revolutionary work, and it was much later, 1976, when he was Prime Minister of Democratic Kampuchea, that he officially adopted the name Pol Pot. He'd used Pol since 1970, but now it was official, complete with a fabricated biography to hide his privileged past.
So we have the man, Solid Tsar, now Pol Pot, shaped by this really complex, often frustrating journey. Let's pivot now to the ideology itself, the fuel for the Khmer Rouge and its rise. After Pol Pot left Vietnam in 1970, the Communist Party of Kampuchea, the CPK, became really driven by this principle, independence mastery. What did that actually mean in practice, and how did it evolve?
Independence mastery. It sounds almost reasonable on the surface, doesn't it? At its core, it was this radical pursuit of self-reliance, complete independence from everyone, Vietnam, China, the West, everyone. Cambodia standing entirely alone.
But it didn't stay just nationalistic, did it?
Not at all.
Yeah.
It quickly morphed into something much darker, an extreme, almost pathological xenophobia. The Khmer Rouge started seeing anyone foreign, or anyone even perceived as having foreign ties or sympathies, as an enemy. Pure poison.
So deep suspicion of outsiders.
Deep suspicion that escalated to outright hostility. They ended up killing foreign journalists who were caught inside, sealing the country off. It was a terrifying shift from, maybe understandable self-sufficiency to paranoid isolation and violence.
And this paranoia wasn't just directed outwards. Pol Pot was ruthless internally too, wasn't he? Purging CPK members seen as too close to Vietnam. You mentioned he decided in '73 that North Vietnam was a friend with a conflict. That sounds ominous.
Deeply ominous.
Sure.
It sounds quite neutral, but it's really a chilling prelude to brutal internal purges. Many Khmer Rouge members who had spent time training or living in North Vietnam were targeted, suspected of divided loyalties, executed.
Why? What was the logic behind turning on their own?
It was absolutely fundamental to Pol Pot consolidating his power and achieving his vision of a pure Cambodian revolution. Any ties to external powers, especially Vietnam, were seen as a threat to independence mastery, and a threat to his absolute control. That phrase, a friend with a conflict, it was just rhetorical cover for eliminating potential rivals or anyone suspected of disloyalty.
So it radicalized the party from within.
Completely. These internal purges effectively weeded out any moderating voices, anyone who might question the increasingly extreme path. It left behind only the most fiercely loyal, the most ideologically rigid, and it created this intense atmosphere of fear and paranoia within the party itself.
Okay, so the party becomes increasingly isolated, paranoid, radicalized. What was the actual end goal, this vision for Cambodia of the self-sufficient agricultural state? And what about the contradictions inherent in that vision?
The core vision was, well, it was incredibly radical. To transform Cambodia back into some kind of pristine agrarian society. No capitalism, no modern industry, no foreign influence whatsoever, no cities even.
Back to year zero, as it's often called.
Exactly. An utterly agrarian society. No money, no markets, just collective farming. But here's the massive, glaring hypocrisy. While they preached this absolute self-reliance, this autarky,
Yes.
China was simultaneously pouring in substantial aid, food aid, weapons, military advisors. Even Mao Zedong himself, reportedly, warned Pol Pot in a secret meeting, told him not to just blindly copy China, warned against repeating drastic, over-the-top measures like the Great Leap Forward.
But Pol Pot didn't listen.
Largely ignored it seems. Steeped in his own vision of independence mastery, he believed Cambodia's revolution had to be even faster, even more absolute, purer than China's. He was determined to forge his own unique, brutal path.
And those drastic measures were certainly implemented. with devastating consequences. Let's talk about collectivization. In May 1973, Pol Pot ordered villages in the areas they controlled to be collectivized. What were they trying to achieve, and what actually happened on the ground?
Collectivization hit two main targets for them. Ideologically, it was about building this pure socialist society, wiping out all private property, all traces of what they saw as feudalism or capitalism. Tactically.
It was about control.
Absolute control, especially over the food supply. It stopped farmers from feeding government troops or supporting any opposition, but for the people living through it, it was catastrophic. Immediate, widespread resentment.
How did people react?
Desperate villagers often slaughtered their own animals, their buffalo, their pigs, rather than let them become collective property. A tragic act of defiance, but it had terrible long-term effects on food production, obviously. And it wasn't just resentment, it was fear. An estimated 60,000 Cambodians fled Khmer Rouge zones in just 6 months after that order, a clear sign of the terror it inspired.
And then came the urban evacuations, another cornerstone policy. September 1974, the decision to forcibly empty the cities, send everyone to the countryside. This wasn't just about logistics, was it? It was ideological.
Deeply ideological. They believed it was absolutely necessary to dismantle capitalism. And for them, capitalism was urban culture. The cities were seen as inherently corrupt, foreign-influenced, parasitic, so they had to be eliminated.
How did they carry it out? Can you paint a picture for us?
The execution was just inhumane, doesn't even begin to cover it. Imagine entire cities, Phnom included, just emptied, people given maybe hours, sometimes just minutes, to grab what they could.
Just like that.
Just like that. Forced out, marched into the countryside. Didn't matter if you were old, sick, a child. And the reports later confirmed about the hospitals. They literally emptied them. Critically ill patients, women who'd just given birth, tiny newborns, the elderly, just pushed down onto the roads. No care, no provisions. Many, many died just on those forced marches.
It's unthinkable.
And it went beyond just emptying cities. They actively sought to eliminate native religions.
Yeah.
Buddhism, Islam, seeing them as part of the old society that had to go. And here's another bizarre contradiction for a supposedly communist movement. They explicitly aimed at eradicating the working class.
Eradicating the working class.
Yes. They saw urban workers, factory workers, as a decadent relic of the past, tainted by capitalism. Their ideal was this new, pure peasant society. It underlines how unique and warped their ideology was. Remember Ieng Sary, Pol Pot's foreign minister, saying in '77, "We are not communists, we are revolutionaries." It shows this wasn't just standard Marxism. It was something else entirely, something uniquely Cambodian and uniquely brutal, tailored to their radical vision.
So the stage was set, these horrifying policies unleashed, leading to the killing fields. The human cost is just, it's almost impossible to process. 1.7 million deaths, you said, a quarter of the population.
And that number includes deaths from everything, not just direct execution, but forced labor, starvation, disease, all stemming from these policies. There were no trials, no legal defense. None. Entire families often wiped out together to prevent future revenge. And the reasons for suspicion, for execution. They became absurdly thin, wearing glasses suggesting you were an intellectual, knowing a foreign language, even just having soft hands indicating you hadn't done manual labor. Any tiny connection to the old society could be a death sentence.
It's systematic dehumanization taken to its absolute extreme. And you mentioned the targeting of specific groups was particularly chilling, the ethnic Chinese Cambodians, for example. You said it was the worst disaster for any ethnic Chinese community in Southeast Asia.
It was devastating for them. Their population dropped dramatically from around 425,000 down to maybe 200,000. And another 170,000 managed to escape, mostly to Vietnam, a huge loss of life and community.
What was the twisted justification the regime used for massacring the ethnic Chinese?
It tied directly back into their core ideology. Anti-capitalist, anti-foreign. The Chinese were stereotyped as traitors, moneylenders, the embodiment of the capitalism the Khmer Rouge wanted to destroy. They were accused of having exploited the Cambodian people.
So class and ethnicity blurred together.
Exactly. Plus, there was resentment over perceived differences, lighter skin color, distinct cultural practices marking them as other, as not purely Khmer. And in 1978, there were specific campaigns where hundreds of Cham, Chinese, and Khmer families were rounded up, told they were being resettled, but actually taken away and executed. Being city dwellers made the Chinese especially vulnerable to the forced evacuations and the regime's anti-urban fury.
And this raises that deeply disturbing point you touched on earlier, China's silence.
Yes. Despite being the Khmer Rouge's main backer, providing all that aid, The government in Beijing did not protest the killings of ethnic Chinese in Cambodia, even while they were loudly condemning Vietnam for supposedly mistreating ethnic Chinese there. It's a stark example of geopolitical interests trumping ethnic solidarity or basic humanity, a very unsettling and still not fully explained piece of this puzzle.
That silence is deafening. What about the Cham people? Another distinct minority group. How are they affected?
The Cham, who are predominantly Muslim, also faced terrible persecution. It's estimated that only about 20 of their 113 most prominent religious leaders, their clergy, survived the regime. That points to a deliberate effort to destroy their cultural and religious identity.
And other groups. Beyond ethnicity.
Oh, yes. The Vietnamese living in Cambodia were explicitly targeted as an ethnic group, seen as both historical enemies and immediate threats. But beyond ethnicity, the regime went after anyone considered tainted by the old society. This meant the educated professionals.
The intellectuals.
Absolutely. Doctors, teachers, lawyers, engineers, artists. Anyone with skills or knowledge linked to the modern world or foreign influence. They were systematically eliminated. If you couldn't prove your peasant credentials, essentially, you were suspect.
This systematic destruction, it even extended to children, didn't it? Which is perhaps the most horrifying aspect of their methods, forcing children to participate.
It's profoundly disturbing.
Yes.
Thousands of children, some really young, early teens. They were conscripted, desensitized, turned into killers. They were indoctrinated to follow any order without hesitation. Their innocence, their empathy, systematically stripped away.
Used as instruments.
Exactly. Used to commit mass murder, torture, other atrocities. And this wasn't just during the main genocide period. Child soldiers were used extensively by the Khmer Rouge remnants right up until 1998 as ammunition carriers, spies, combatants, often forcibly recruited. They were seen as easier to mold, easier to control than adults.
Yeah.
And their youth provided this perverse kind of cover for the brutality.
You have to ask, what does it reveal about a regime that weaponizes innocence like that, turning children into tools of death, and the long-term consequences for a society? When its young people are scarred so deeply, it's a question that just, it lingers, doesn't it?
It really does.
But this horror wasn't happening in a vacuum. The world knew, or at least parts of the world knew, and yet there was hesitation, complicity even. This is where the mystery of the international response really deepens.
It's one of the most unsettling parts of the whole story. Take the British government. They knew. There's evidence they were aware of the atrocities unfolding as early as May 1975. Just weeks after the Khmer Rouge seized Phnom Penh.
Weeks?
Yes. And despite knowing, they actually extended diplomatic recognition to the new regime. No formal relations, but recognition nonetheless. Their own internal assessments concluded that the refugee accounts' stories of mass killings, forced marches were compatible and authentic, even if they couldn't verify every single detail themselves.
So they believed the reports, internally at least.
It seems so, which makes the skepticism from others, like the French foreign minister at the time, Jean-Sylvain Arc, who dismissed early reports as just propaganda, even more striking. The information was getting out, at least to some governments.
Awareness, then. But what about action? You mentioned the British response was a paradox. They were the first to condemn the human rights violations publicly at the UN, the UNCHR, in 1978. That sounds strong. But was it?
On the surface, yes. But when you dig deeper, you see how much realpolitik shaped their actions. For listeners, realpolitik basically means putting practical considerations, national interest, power balances, strategic advantage ahead of ethics or ideology.
So, Cold War politics trumped human rights concerns.
Pretty much. Cambodia wasn't seen as a traditional British sphere of influence. It was viewed more as America's problem, a proxy battlefield in the Cold War. British officials even admitted their condemnations were aimed more at signaling their position to allies, the U.S., Australia, Japan, than expecting to directly influence Phnom Penh.
And diplomatic life just continued?
Astonishingly, yes. Even as these horrific reports were coming in, diplomatic niceties continued to be observed. The Khmer Rouge ambassador was invited to the Queen's birthday party in London. British officials attended the regime's liberation anniversary receptions. It's jarring to think about formal diplomacy carrying on amidst such barbarity.
It's hard to reconcile those two realities. So what concrete steps did they take, beyond words and party invitations?
Well, they did make some symbolic gestures. They refused to accredit their ambassador to Phnom Penh, signaling disapproval. And they donated money, £250,000, to the UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, for Cambodian refugee relief, which was vital, of course.
But was it enough?
Even their own foreign secretary at the time, Dr. David Owen, admitted it was a pretty thin policy. He acknowledged its limitations. And it's really important to stress, the sources highlight the crucial role played by the British public. Public pressure, outrage from ordinary citizens, charities, the media. That's often what forced the government to take stronger stances than they might have otherwise.
Public pressure can make a difference, but this brings us back to that core, deeply uncomfortable issue. Cold War geopolitics overriding basic humanity. How long could the world justify ignoring the suffering for the sake of this global chess game?
That calculation became even starker after Vietnam invaded Cambodia in January 1979. The invasion kicked out the Khmer Rouge, installed a new Vietnamese-backed government, the People's Republic of Kampuchea, or PRK.
So the Khmer Rouge were overthrown.
Yes, but here's the twist. The deposed Khmer Rouge, now fighting a guerrilla war from the jungles, suddenly started seeking international legitimacy. They wanted UN support against the Vietnamese-backed government.
And they got it.
Incredibly, yes. At an emergency UN session right after the invasion, January 79, a majority of countries, 71 of them, including the UK and the US, voted to let the Pol Pot government keep Cambodia's seat at the United Nations.
Let the Khmer Rouge represent Cambodia at the UN, after everything.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they held that seat until 1993, long after the Cold War was supposedly over.
Why? What was the rationale? It seems unbelievable.
The rationale was pure Cold War logic. Utterly cynical. It was all about opposing the new government in Phnom Penh because it was backed by Vietnam and, by extension, the Soviet Union. So suddenly, Western interests aligned with the Khmer Rouge, seeing them as a useful counterweight to Vietnamese influence in the region.
Humanitarian concerns just went out the window.
Completely. As one British MP, Stanley Nowens, said at the time, it was deplorable, a decision determined not by humanitarian considerations but by pure power politics. And then there's China, again consistently supporting the Khmer Rouge-led coalition fighting the PRK, despite the regime having massacred ethnic Chinese. Their geopolitical goals clearly outweighed everything else.
It's a chilling example of international priorities. Did Britain eventually change course? They did de-recognize the regime, didn't they?
They did, eventually. By October 1979, the evidence of the atrocities was overwhelming, and the Khmer Rouge clearly weren't in effective control of the country anymore. It became, as the official language put it, increasingly difficult to justify, recognizing a regime that was so highly distasteful and powerless.
Was it seen as a meaningful step?
Opinions were divided. Some critics called it an empty gesture, coming far too late. But for the diplomats involved, it was apparently a difficult decision, partly because it was clearly unwelcome to China, a major power they didn't want to alienate. This whole episode really throws into sharp relief that complex, often morally fraught dance between national interest and human rights on the world stage. It really makes you ask, doesn't it, how much suffering gets ignored in the name of stability or strategic advantage?
Those are questions that unfortunately don't go away. They echo through history. Now, let's shift to the aftermath inside Cambodia. The long, incredibly difficult path towards reconciliation. And one of the first hurdles, a really fundamental one, is this ongoing debate. Should what happened even be legally classified as genocide? When the experts can't agree, how does a society even start to define its own trauma?
It's a hugely significant debate, and it goes right to the heart of how we understand and label mass atrocities. You have some very respected scholars who've argued against the genocide label, or at least qualified it. Michael Vickery, for instance, suggested the killings were more like spontaneous excesses of a vengeful, undisciplined peasant army. Less systematic, less centrally directed genocidal intent.
So, brutality, yes, but maybe not genocide in the strict legal sense.
That was his argument. David Chandler, another leading historian, argued that while, yes, ethnic minorities suffered terribly, they were targeted primarily as perceived enemies of the regime, not necessarily because of their ethnicity itself. He explicitly rejected terms like chauvinism and genocide, partly because he felt comparing it directly to Hitler wasn't accurate or helpful. Stephen Heider also argued the atrocities weren't primarily motivated by racism. So there's a strong strand of scholarship focusing more on the political, class-based, and anti-urban nature of the violence, rather than purely ethnic targeting meeting the strict UN definition.
Okay, so that's one side emphasizing the political and social dimensions, but there are equally strong arguments for classifying it as genocide, right?
Absolutely. Ben Kiernan has been a very powerful voice arguing it was genocide. He brought forward incredibly detailed evidence, particularly focusing on the systematic targeting of the Cham people, showing clear intent to destroy them as a group. And Gregory Stanton, who founded Genocide Watch, concluded definitively that it constituted genocide.
On what grounds?
Stanton argued it fits both the UN Genocide Convention, specifically citing the intentional destruction of parts of the Vietnamese and Cham ethnic groups, and also Raphael Lemkin's original, broader concept of genocide, which included destroying political and social groups. So for Kiernan and Stanton, the targeting of ethnic and religious minorities was clear evidence of genocidal intent alongside the other mass killings.
So you have this deep disagreement among historians and scholars, but then an international tribunal, the ECCC, actually delivered verdicts on this very question.
Yes, and this is crucial. The extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia, the ECCC, ultimately found two top Khmer Rouge leaders, Nguyen Chea and Khieu Samphan, guilty of genocide. Specifically, genocide against the Vietnamese and Cham minorities.
So the court sided with Kiernan and Stanton's view.
In a legal sense, yes. Their 2018 verdict provided a definitive legal judgment, affirming that specific ethnic and religious groups were targeted with genocidal intent under international law. This gives legal weight to one side of the academic debate. But the fact that the scholarly debate persists really highlights just how complex it is to categorize these horrors, especially when the motivation seems so multi-layered: political, ideological, ethnic, social, all mixed together.
When the experts wrestle with the definition, you can only imagine how hard it is for the society itself to reach a consensus on the nature of its past. And this leads us to Pol Pot's own legacy. This disturbing denial he maintained right to the end, and the incredibly difficult search for accountability.
It definitely creates fractures in collective memory, and Pol Pot himself, it's deeply chilling. In that final interview he gave to Nate Thayer in 1997, while he was under house arrest by his own former comrades, he seemed utterly composed. Claimed his conscience is clear.
His conscience was clear after overseeing the deaths of 1.7 million people.
That's what he said. Everything I did for my country. He denied ordering the killing of millions, denied targeting babies, the young ones, famously said, "To say that millions died is too much." It leaves you with this profound psychological mystery. How does someone responsible for that level of suffering maintain that stance? Is it total self-delusion, unshakable ideological conviction, or just a complete terrifying disconnect from reality? We don't know. The sources can't give us a definitive answer there.
That disconnect is chilling. What about justice for the victims? How has that played out over the decades since the regime fell?
It's been an agonizingly slow and difficult process, marked by long periods of what many call the persistence of impunity. Right after the Khmer Rouge were ousted in 1979, there was a tribunal, the People's Revolutionary Tribunal, or PRT. It found Pol Pot and Ieng Sary guilty of genocide in absentia, meaning they weren't there for the trial.
So a conviction, but symbolic.
Largely symbolic, and later widely criticized as a politically motivated show trial by the new Vietnamese-backed government. It lacked international recognition and, crucially, in the chaos of 1979 famine, ongoing fighting, people desperately searching for lost family, the verdict had very little public impact inside Cambodia. Survival was the only thing that mattered then.
So not a real step towards justice or reconciliation at that point. What came later? The ECCC you mentioned.
Yes, the ECCC, the Khmer Rouge Tribunal, was a much more significant internationally backed effort. It was finally established in 2003, judges appointed in 2006. Its specific mandate was to try the senior leaders and those most responsible for the atrocities committed between 1975 and 1979.
And it did achieve some convictions.
It did. Nguyen Chea and Khieu Samphan were convicted, including for genocide, as we discussed. King Gekaiv, known as Dutch, the head of the S-21 prison, was also convicted. So it delivered a measure of retributive justice, punishing key perpetrators. And importantly, it was the first international tribunal to allow active participation by victims through a dedicated victim support unit, which was quite groundbreaking.
That's definitely progress on the legal front. But justice isn't just about convictions, is it? What about truth? Reconciliation? Were there obstacles there?
Huge obstacles, especially when it comes to restorative justice, repairing harm, finding truth, fostering reconciliation. Attempts to set up a formal public truth commission in Cambodia, like South Africa had, have consistently run into opposition from within the current Cambodian government.
Why the opposition?
It's complex, but part of it is that some figures within the current government were themselves former Khmer Rouge officials who defected later on. There's a reluctance to dig too deeply into the past in ways that could be politically destabilizing. Remember that research committee back in 1979? It collected information on mass graves and killings, but its findings were barely publicized. And, as one scholar noted, truth commissions don't work if people don't know what they found. So for decades, impunity reigned. No Khmer Rouge perpetrators were sentenced within Cambodia. And even now, financial support for treating torture survivors is incredibly limited. The struggle for comprehensive healing is far from over.
The legal and political struggles are immense, but beneath that, how does an entire society even begin to heal psychologically from something so pervasive, something that touched literally every family? The scars must run incredibly deep.
Incredibly deep. Profoundly so. Research among survivors shows sky-high rates of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, chronic anger, lingering feelings of revenge. These are widespread. You have to understand, violence like this, especially intentional, state-sponsored torture, it doesn't just hurt the body. It shatters fundamental psychological needs.
Like what?
Things like basic trust in others, in institutions, your sense of self-worth, your identity, your feeling of being effective, of having some control over your life, your positive connections to other people. All of that gets destroyed. Survivors often see the world as just inherently dangerous, untrustworthy. It leaves this pervasive sense of vulnerability. It can even lead to cycles of violence within communities, especially where victims and former low-level perpetrators have to live side by side.
And this trauma, it doesn't just stop with the generation that lived through it, does it? We hear about transgenerational trauma. How does that manifest in Cambodia? Why is it considered another unsolved human challenge?
That's such a crucial point. Because torture, especially because it's intentional cruelty inflicted by other humans, it doesn't just wound the survivor. It absolutely wounds the next generations. It's passed down not genetically, but psychologically and socially.
How does that work?
Through silence, often.
Yeah.
Through family secrets. The unspoken pain, the fear, the guilt, the shame. They become like phantoms haunting the family. Children, grandchildren, they might inherit anxiety, depression, aggression, difficulties with trust, even if they don't fully understand why. The trauma ripples outwards and downwards through time. So healing isn't just an individual task, it's a collective one, a generational one. And finding effective ways to break that cycle, that remains a huge challenge, not just in Cambodia, but globally.
So faced with this deep, multi-generational trauma, how does a society start to reckon with it? How do they begin the process of healing and remembrance? Sites of memory must be critical, like Tuol Sleng, the Genocide Museum, which used to be the S-21 prison.
Tuol Sleng is. It's a profoundly powerful and incredibly harrowing place. It's estimated between 17,000 and 20,000 people were imprisoned there, interrogated, tortured mercilessly. Only about 12 people are known to have survived S-21.
12 out of thousands.
12. And today, the buildings are preserved almost exactly as they were found when the Vietnamese army entered Phnom Penh in 1979. You walk through, you see the tiny, crude brick cells. You see the thousands upon thousands of chilling photographic portraits the Khmer Rouge took of their prisoners before they were killed. You see the paintings by Van Noth, one of the few survivors, depicting the torture. It's an absolutely essential site for remembrance, for education, for bearing witness. It helps younger generations begin to grasp the human reality of the statistics.
And the confessions extracted there, they weren't just personal, were they? They fueled the paranoia.
Exactly. Prisoners weren't just forced to confess their own supposed crimes. Under torture, they had to name names, list alleged traitors, friends, colleagues, family members, sometimes hundreds of names. Each confession then led to more arrests, more interrogations, more torture, more names. It was this terrifying, self-perpetuating machine of death, driven by paranoia.
But even a place like Tuol Sleng, a site of memory, it can become controversial, can't it? There was a debate about its authenticity.
Yes, unfortunately. Politics intrudes everywhere, even into memory. An opposition leader, Kem Sokha, claimed at one point that some artifacts at Tuol Sleng were actually fabricated by the Vietnamese after 1979, basically to make the Khmer Rouge look worse.
That's a serious accusation.
It caused huge outrage, understandably. His party later tried to walk it back, saying it was taken out of context, but the damage was done. It stands in stark contrast to people like Ben Kiernan and Gregory Stanton, who personally saw the S-21 records, the photos, right back in 1980, and have testified unequivocally to their authenticity. It just shows how the past remains a battleground, how historical narratives are still politically charged in Cambodia today.
And alongside sites like Tuol Sleng, there's the annual Day of Commemoration. That seems to have evolved quite significantly over the years.
It really has, and its evolution reflects Cambodia's own journey. It started back in 1984 as the National Day of Hatred. Its initial purpose was explicitly political, aimed against the Khmer Rouge and their international backers, later used to mobilize people against the possibility of the Pol Pot clique returning to power.
So more about anger and opposition initially.
Yes, but by 2001 it was officially renamed the Day of Commemoration. The focus shifted. The message became broader. Not forget about the past, yes, but also moving towards remembrance, reflection, and healing.
What happens on that day?
There are public meetings, ceremonies held all across the country every May 20th. Wreath layings, traditional music, prayers, speeches by officials and survivors. And importantly, these events often serve a vital therapeutic function. They provide a safe, culturally appropriate space for victims to recount their experiences, sometimes even reenact them. It's similar, in a way, to trauma confrontation therapy. It allows for the public expression of deep-seated grief, anger, and pain in a supportive environment.
That sounds incredibly important, but given the scale of the trauma and this transgenerational aspect you mentioned, education seems absolutely critical for the future. What's the situation with historical knowledge among young Cambodians today? Do they learn about this period?
This is where there's a really significant and frankly quite troubling gap. Most young Cambodians, something like two-thirds are aged 29 or younger, they know surprisingly little about the Khmer Rouge regime. Over 80% actually describe their own knowledge as poor or very poor.
80%? Why so little?
It largely comes down to a lack of public education on the topic. For many years, the period from 1975 to 1979 just wasn't comprehensively taught in schools. It was too sensitive, too recent, too politically charged. Think about it. Only 6% of young Cambodians reported learning about the Khmer Rouge era in school.
Only 6%.
But here's the hopeful part. 85% of those same young people said they actively want to know more. There's a hunger for understanding their own history. But for a long time, there was this dangerous vacuum of knowledge.
That's a massive disconnect between the need for knowledge and the provision of it. Are things changing? What's being done to bridge that gap and also to rebuild the mental health support that was destroyed?
There are efforts, definitely, but the scale of the challenge remains immense. The very first comprehensive school textbook about the genocide, developed at the Documentation Center of Cambodia, DCCAM, wasn't issued until 2009. That's quite recent.
30 years after the regime fell.
Exactly. And there are projects now like Youth for Justice and Reconciliation, doing vital work, running workshops, fostering dialogue between generations, trying to bridge that gap. But on the mental health side, the Khmer Rouge didn't just kill people, they destroyed infrastructure. Cambodia's public health system was decimated. They killed two of the country's few psychiatrists, shut down the only mental health hospital. Rebuilding that capacity from scratch with very limited resources has been incredibly difficult. There are still far too few trained mental health professionals for a population carrying such immense trauma.
So even when the need is glaringly obvious, the resources just aren't there. Are there any therapeutic approaches that have shown promise for survivors, or is it mostly just coping?
There have been some promising, albeit limited, initiatives. Studies on cognitive behavioral psychotherapy, or CBP, have shown it can help reduce PTSD symptoms and even increase feelings of forgiveness among survivors in pilot programs. Narrative exposure therapy, NET, which helps people process traumatic memories by constructing a coherent life narrative, has also shown good results, particularly with refugees and asylum seekers.
So there are tools that could work.
Yes, the potential is there, but the big problems remain. Getting consistent funding for these programs, scaling them up, and doing rigorous research to track long-term outcomes. Many rehabilitation programs struggle just to keep their doors open. Clinicians are often overwhelmed with direct care, leaving little time or resources for the kind of research needed to prove effectiveness definitively and advocate for more support. Challenges like small sample sizes in studies, difficulties controlling for biases, they persist.
It paints this picture, doesn't it? A society grappling with transgenerational trauma, limited access to historical knowledge, scarce resources for healing. In that kind of environment, how can true, deep collective healing and reconciliation ever be fully achieved? It leaves you with this sense of an unresolved echo, a story not yet finished.
It does, profoundly. That's exactly the feeling. Despite the passage of decades now, despite the tribunal's verdicts, despite all the incredibly brave and vital efforts towards remembrance and healing, fundamental questions about the Cambodian tragedy they persist, they hang in the air.
The why remains elusive, the motivations of leaders like Pol Pot still ultimately unknowable, perhaps. The complex, deeply troubling role of international politics that allowed or even enabled the horrors. And of course, the profound, deeply personal scars carried by survivors and passed down through generations. It all remains this chilling, complex puzzle.
A puzzle that still demands our attention, our reflection.
Absolutely. The Cambodian experience stands as this stark, unavoidable reminder, doesn't it? A reminder of humanity's terrifying capacity for immense cruelty, but also, importantly, its capacity for extraordinary resilience, for survival, for the slow, painful work of rebuilding.
And getting to any true depth of understanding means confronting not just what happened, but those really uncomfortable questions of why it happened, how it was allowed to happen, and what lessons, if any, we can possibly draw for our collective future. It's a story that's far from over. It continues to unfold, demanding our attention not just as a historical event, but as a solemn warning, and maybe, just maybe, as a testament to that ongoing, incredibly difficult human struggle for justice, for peace, and for that long, arduous road towards healing.